We began exploring a new book together last week. It's called Sabbath as Resistance. It was written by Walter Brueggemann. And in our planning together, Amanda and I thought that this would be a great approach to the season of Lent. And I would still like to invite you along. We have some copies of this book available. As you see, it's not a huge book. It's certainly something that would be a wonderful part of anyone's Lenten practice and journey to read a chapter at a time. We're doing a chapter a week here in worship. But as it turns out, this book is published by the Presbyterian company Westminster John Knox. And while Walter Brueggemann is a United Church of Christ pastor, he teaches Old Testament at Columbia Seminary in Georgia, which is a Presbyterian school, which I'm sure is his connection to Westminster John Knox. But Michael Hilliard, if you have not, Michael, you and Amy, if you all would raise a hand, just give a wave. Michael works for that publisher. And when he saw that we were going to be using this book, he made a very gracious offer to us to get copies at a very nice discount. And so I definitely encourage you to take advantage of that. We have some copies if you would like one for $8.40 is what we calculated them to come out to, which is a really nice discount that you can take advantage of. Oh, yes. As Amanda says, if you want a book, we'll give you a book. And we'll make sure you have it. Right. Now, the roads were not all that great last Sunday. In fact, a lot of churches did not even have services at all, and not every one of us was able to be here last week as we started this series. So I want to give a quick introduction and recap of chapter 1. Brueggemann is inviting us to consider the culture and the world in which we live, and notice that there are parallels to the grueling life of endless work under the system and the gods of Egypt and the pharaohs. The demand to have more and more grain back then, and more places to store this grain, and more monuments to the greatness of Pharaoh. It meant that the Hebrew slaves were pushed to work relentlessly, producing bricks. No time off, no rest, no break in the schedule. I mean, these people were being crushed. So then we see that this God we have known and understood all these years later, because of these ancient people, the Hebrews, this is the God who heard their cries in Egypt and acted in astounding ways to free them, deliver them, and grace them with their own land and future. This is the story of the Exodus. And what happens not long after these slaves were freed into the wilderness is that God initiates this new understanding of how people are to approach life. And through the figure of Moses, and inscribed on stone tablets, God delivers the 10 Commandments. The book that we are studying wants us to remember the story from which these words came. God was freeing people from slavery. And in the very first commandment, the opening introduction that God gives to the people is what? I mean, do you know how these words go, the 10 Commandments? Something like 70% of us don't know them, according to a recent Barna Group study. Something else. Anyhow, the Ten Commandments open with God's own introduction. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. Walter Brueggemann holds out that this introduction from God has really exciting possibilities for us again, because this God is always the God who is freeing people from all kinds of slavery. And so the first commandment still reads, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods. That's commandment number 1, and last week we really tried to make the connections from old ancient Egypt and life under the pharaohs to what our lives have become and are becoming in this non-stop digital world and undying demands for more and more and more production and consumption, achievement and advancement. We never fully rest. I mean, to the point where this fourth commandment from God seems like a weird, naive, almost disposable piece. A holdover from the ancient world that couldn't possibly apply to life anymore, right? God says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Is God serious? It's in the Ten Commandments just as sure that one about murdering people, lying, stealing. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. It goes on to say, you shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or female servant, your livestock, or the alien resident in your town. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Now, going back to the point about these commandments being a part of the Exodus story, where the God of liberation steps in to free the Hebrews. What we see is that God offers this radical alternative to the very place where their lives had been so crushing. Because there, the demand for work and production never ended. And back there, the Hebrews were little more than work animals, really. And there, pharaohs did not allow such things as rest. But here, God says that every single week, we're all just going to stop together for entire day, all of us, together. It can be a holy time to simply be and to trust and appreciate creation. And even God does this. Clocks out, if you will. Our book's point is that this idea of Sabbath is really not dispensable, because it always stands as God's prescription for life in the midst of a world that never seems to stop. And if Brueggemann is right, and this is a real description of our own world right now, one where we have trouble even appreciating a day of rest without feeling guilty, let alone doing so every single week. One where we maintain this almost constant digital contact with all things related to work. One where we learn daily that our worth, our value, lies primarily in our ability to produce and consume. Perhaps there is wisdom for us after all in that strange fourth commandment to completely rest on a regular basis. Which is where we find ourselves in the next chapter. Notice that the fourth commandment, remembering the Sabbath, notice that it sits in between the expectations for our relationship with God. That's the first three commandments. It sits between those first three God-related commandments and the final six, which are all concerned with how we all live together as people. Linking them together is number 4, the Sabbath. Those others read like this: honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox, or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. So God is introduced as the liberator of people, commandment 1. And we are then given boundaries for our relationship with God that include not making idols, not misusing God's name, and we are then told to rest on a regular basis with this God. It's only then that we get to the more familiar parts of the code having to do with our actions towards one another. The 10 Commandments. Essentially, we get the framework for the way Jesus describes the entire law, don't we? Do you see this? Someone once asked him, "What is the greatest commandment of all?" And what did he say? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. Oh, and a second one is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love God. Love people. Those are the 10 Commandments, essentially, aren't they? And in the middle, connecting them, is Sabbath. The question as we move forward is, if any of this is even possible or sustainable without the idea or the practice of regular, intentional, complete periods of rest with God. And the argument of the book that we are studying is that without some practice of Sabbath rest, the answer just might be no. That we might be incapable as living with one another as true neighbors, or even loving this God completely if we do not consistently allow ourselves to rest as God also rests. Now, the world that God delivered the Hebrews from was defined by anxiety. Anxiety to produce at breakneck speed. Anxiety to always have an abundance in case of famine. Anxiety. And in Egypt, the prospect of actually understanding people as neighbors that we might respect and enjoy, that was minimized as the demands for work and production went around the clock, around the week, around the entire calendar. But when the Hebrews reached the desert freedom, God breaks all of that for the people that He has delivered. And this commandment goes so far as to ask this rest of everyone and everything. Did you need that? Did you read that? No one should work. I mean, not even the servants. The immigrant field workers. Not even the animals. Don't just rest for your own good. Do this thing as a community. And in this way, everyone will break the life of anxiety together, which might utterly change how we understand life. Anxiety, it is argued, is the underlying condition that causes us to treat each other as anything but neighbors. Anxiety causes us to desire what others around us have in their lives, causes us to steal, to forsake our family bonds, to ruin our neighbor's name so that we might have some gain from it, to chase after pleasure outside of our committed relationships, even murder. Underneath all of that is anxiety. And Sabbath offers a way out. Sabbath requires trust that for one day at least, we will stop and recognize that indeed we do actually have all that we ever need for life together. And that the gift of God's creation is very, very good. I mean, that's where we're headed with all of this, and I am actually very interested to see where it might end up. I mean, how might you or I or us together, how might we possibly consider recovering Sabbath in these complicated days and in this age? What would that possibly look like? When could it really happen in the midst of my crazy life or your crazy life? What does it really mean to rest instead of work? Can I exercise? Can I do other things? What would it look like if we could move from understanding these ancient words, not as one more demand on our lives, but as a wonderful gift from God to just put everything down and chill? And that God is more than okay with us doing this. God's not calling us lazy. God really wants this and kind of enjoys it. And God sees amazing possibilities for the entire world through this. And if we choose, we can be a part of it. Do you remember when Jesus was reflecting on the Sabbath as God's gracious gift that we might enjoy? He said, people, we're not made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for people. I invite you to find ways to enjoy it.